me ask you, have you ever heard of, who was that? Margaret Thatcher?
So yes, that's a bizarre. Somebody said recently that when somebody has major success early in their life, the big question is, will there be a second act? Because when that comes to an end, what then do you do? And for me, it was playing Margaret Thatcher. Very bizarrely, I very much was an impressionist. I still do impressions, as you've seen, and things. But Mrs. Thatcher was my income for many, many years. So I worked on a television series called Spitting Image, which was a puppet show, which had puppets of famous people, including Ronald Reagan at the time and Margaret Thatcher. And that's right, I did the voice of the British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, in their television series. And very austere she was too. And obviously she had a very good relationship with Ronald Reagan, and there was a very famous sketch where Mrs. Thatcher was basically a puppet poodle. I mean, she was clearly Mrs. Thatcher, but she was sort of made into a poodle, and sort of, as it were, being very affectionate to Ronald Reagan, and Ronald Reagan, I didn't do his voice, but he basically looked into the camera and said, "Oh, what a woman. Shame it's only her country I'm screwing." So that was the sort of joke, if you allow that, on this recording that show did. And that went on for many, many years. And I worked on that show for 10 years, and it bought me a house. And that was my first act, as it were. But then, of course, Mrs. Thatcher came to an end, and everybody said to me, "What are you going to do now? What are you going to do now? What are you going to do now?" And I did a mixture of sort of corporate entertainment and puppeteering. I worked as a puppeteer because I learned the skill of, I was no interested in puppeteering, but I learned the skills working on Spitting Image. And then I spent the next 10 years working on various children's programs in the UK. People thought I disappeared because I was no longer on television. In fact, I was on television pretty much every day of the week, but you never saw me. I was a puppet in a and I did a series called Cat's Eyes, and my niece, who was 6 years old at the time, because it was for children, she kept telling the teacher that she knew the cat. I played a cat, and she knew the cat. And when my sister and her husband went to the school, and they said, "We're sorry to tell you, but your daughter keeps telling lies. She keeps saying that she knows the cat." And my sister said, "Well, she does. That's my brother." So then the school found out about that, and I sent them some scripts of the show and some pictures of what we look like, and so on. So she loved all that, did my niece, as a 6-year-old would, who has this weird uncle that's a cat on television.
And she definitely wasn't telling lies.
No, she wasn't telling lies. No,
right.
But you see, somebody has to do it. I mean, there was an assumption there that she couldn't possibly know somebody that worked on television. There's a, it's a job. It's a job that somebody does. So I met Jim Henson during that period. I auditioned to be a reindeer in Santa Claus the movie. Now, I am not physically that fit, and the puppets I held up were often light, and I didn't get the job as the reindeer. And in fact, I think they ended up using real reindeer, but it was a great thrill, at least to audition and meet Jim Henson. And I worked on a series called Dark Crystal recently. Which was Jim Henson's production. I did work on Muppet Treasure Island. I was a chicken or an ink spot or something. It was very much in the back of shots. So, but technically, I have worked for the Muppets as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, so we don't need AI to bring Margaret Thatcher back because
Oh
we have
goodness
you.
me, no! Of course not. And oddly enough, I still do her today, and it tends to be for films where the original copyright cannot be used, or at least the recording that Mrs. Thatcher did in the House of Commons cannot be put into entertainment films. They can use it in news broadcasts, but they can't. She can't become part of the entertainment of a film. And I often go in and do those lines. So they said, we'd love to use the real thing, Steve. You know, she's better than you are at it. But since we're not allowed to, for copyright reasons, we can use what she says, but we can't use a recording of her saying it. So they get me in to do. I don't do it that often, but I have done quite a few of those over the years, and that's probably now the only time that I get to do Margaret Thatcher, except in interviews and stuff, which I'm very happy to do.
Okay, very good. Now, when I hear someone say that I get up early in the morning and I work for 5 hours on writing or performing arts, voiceovers, and they also say that I only take off Christmas, that to me sounds like a passion. And there is a saying that when you're choosing a career or perhaps an area of arts or performing arts, make sure that it's something you love, because you're going to be doing a lot of it. And
Yes.
it sounds like to me that you have a passion for what you do.
Yes, and I've only relatively recently become an author. Somebody said that you're a writer if you write, you're an author if you're published, and so I've only recently become an author. But here's the thing: many years ago, people said to me, "You should write, Steve. You really should write." I said, "I don't think I'm that great a writer." And a friend of mine, sadly no longer with us, he said to me, "Maybe not, but you're a great storyteller." And he said, you can fix writing, you can't fix storytelling. Storytelling is something that just comes from you, that AI can't do. AI could probably fix the writing. So I write and then I rewrite, and I do get the writing good, not spectacularly good in the way that some people are just exceptionally good writers. I wouldn't claim that, but I make it readable and hopefully make, if I can make every sentence interesting. Somebody said that, just don't write an uninteresting sentence. So every time I rewrite something, I just, not florid or extra words, but just find a way of making the sentence interesting. And that's just graft. It's a mixture of graft, whatever you want to call it. And that's just hard work. The stories, it's just where they come from, I don't know, but they've always been there, you see. Ever since I was 5 years old, I've made up stories. I made up the TARDIS stories, going into the outside world from my living room. That's what always stories. And I had a difficult childhood, like many people in the creative arts. I don't think it's especially difficult. There's nothing, but to give you a context to it, when I was 9, my mother came home from work and she just laid on the couch and died. She just from nowhere died. So I was suddenly aware that life can just completely change. And I knew that my life had changed at that moment. So my father was schizophrenic and was often hospitalized, or people would come and he'd be gone for a few months when he'd be in hospital. And he was a good man. He was a good man, but suffered quite often from mental illness and was emotionally volatile. And me and my sister lived there with him for about 5 years, which was very difficult. But I had an escape, and my 2 escapes were stories, making up stories. Classic example of what happens with a child in experiencing trauma, and the other one was my auntie. And here's the mix. So my father didn't approve of hot water. He didn't like hot water because you had to pay for it, and he had no money. So he said, go to your auntie's for a bath. So in those days it was a weekly bath. It's very different now. I do shower more often, but I would go to my auntie's for a weekly bath, and things were difficult. And my auntie was quite an elderly lady, and she was very, very good to me. But when I had a bath, here's the thing with time, I used to hold on to the taps in the bath, and they were my time portal to the future. And in the future, I used to talk to my future self. So I'm a 10-year-old, 11-year-old boy holding onto the taps, and I'm talking to myself who's older. And my older self keeps saying, Stephen, everything's going to be fine. It's all going to be fine. It really is. Cut to 10 years later, I get a phone call. I'm at university. My auntie has died, and would I come home to Leeds and organize the funeral? Because there was nobody else to do it. And I said yes. And I went to visit the house. And of course, the first thing I did was go up to the bathroom, and I held on to the taps, and I became that future self that had spoken to the 10-year-old boy. Now, a psychologist would say that you're dealing with trauma, you're dealing with grief. And I don't actually believe in time travel, but it was a sort of cosmic moment. And I realized how powerful the fancy of the mind, to borrow an idea from Dickens, the fancy of the mind, how powerful that can be, and how important it is for people to use that in order to escape. I don't like people being dismissive of escapism, and I did a lecture once, and I said, do not mock escapism if you've never had to escape. You're very privileged if you've never had to escape. So my escapism was my auntie's bath and the stories and the fiction that I made. I don't think I'm any different in a way to other actors and writers and performers, and frankly anybody else that has gone through difficult traumas and grief and so on. That's just the way the mind works. I suppose the only thing that is I then let that mind create bizarre stories and so on. So my Swidger's book, The Time That Never Was, people said to me, you've lived an interesting life, especially as a kid. Why don't you write about it? And I said, no, I don't want to. But it's essentially, the book is essentially a fantasy version of my life as a child.
Really?
So there's a character called Granny who is based on my grandmother and my auntie. It's all the wonderful Northern England tough women. The people in the north, the women there are tougher. They have more difficult lives than people in the south because they don't have money, and it's very they're tough women. And I mentioned when the book came out, I got in touch with my old school teacher, my English teacher, who's called Mr. Flynn, and I said, oh, it's based on my grandmother. And he said, do you mean Mrs. Oddie? I said, you remember her name? It's 40 years ago. He said, nobody could forget Mrs. Oddie. She was terrifying. I never saw her as terrifying. She was my savior. But to him, this very tough love woman was terrifying. I said, well, how terrifying? He said, well, when she came to the parent-teachers association meeting, the fear, and this is his expression, I love it. He said, the fear was at bowel movement level. he was that frightened of her. But he said there she was 70, and she was 70 years of age, bringing up two teenage children. He was at the time 24, and I now understand, looking back, why he would be frightened and intimidated by this woman who if I ever complained about anything, she said, I've lived through 2 world wars. And she had. She'd been a child a child of 10 in 1916, in the middle of the First World War, and she had brought up 2 children by herself while her husband was in the army in Italy, and he worked as a driver, which was lucky. You know, he didn't see combat, but he was a driver, but he was away for years. And she brought up 2 children by herself in difficult circumstances for most of the Second World War. So she wasn't somebody you could complain to about your troubles. So, and she was also very funny, and she had malapropisms, and she'd get a speech wrong, like a lot of elderly people sometimes do. And we were having a conversation once about ghosts and spirits, and she said, "Oh, to tell you the truth, Stephen, to tell you the truth, when it comes to ghosts, I've always been very skeptical." And, you know, she would just, and all those are in the book, you know, and that way of speaking, and I you know, that she talks about those in the book. Granny talks about those. Yes, those. They're talking about the Sabbath, and, you know, not working on the Sabbath, which I remember as a child. Nobody worked on the Sabbath. And she talks about that still happens when she calls them those American evangelicals, and she, you know, she gets all that. So it's got some, you know, sort of adult references to a degree, but essentially it's an entertainment. And actually, when the school teacher told me that he was frightened of her, I then decided to write an entire scene where she goes to a school and meets all the teachers, which kids have loved. They think that's the funniest. A classic children's story, in the sense it's merely for 12-year-olds plus, but it's where the child has no power, but the child meets somebody that can outwit those that are in charge of them, if that makes sense. And I think children love that. You know, that when somebody can, teachers are in charge of you, but if you can get somebody who can be in charge of the teachers, and outwit the teachers, that's what children love, and that particularly. But it's got, you know, it's a 3-part, hopefully a 3-part book. The first part's The Time That Never Was. Hopefully the second part comes out next year, and I still have to write but I still have to write the third one, and that I haven't written yet, but I know what happens in it. And in the second one, there is some sort of time travel in the first one to a degree. The second one is very much a time travel story. It's set in the modern day, and without explanation, there's a sort of thunderstorm, and the world becomes different. The world is completely changed. They're in the same place. They're in London, but it's a different London, and they don't know why it has changed. And it's too complicated to the plot to go into. But the basic premise is that there are 2 versions of London and England, and only one of them can survive. And Granny and William have to make sure that the good one survives. So it's a sort of alternate universe where time will eventually choose between the 2 worlds that are there. And it does so logically. It doesn't have any moral interest. So I've made time. It's interesting with Doctor Who, because Doctor Who has developed over the years its own rules, folklore, whatever you want to call it. And there is an element of time being an entity, a sentient entity that is there. A bit like the TARDIS is more than just a police box. Over the years, it's developed a sort of metaphysical beingness. You know, it's become an entity in itself. And it never was in the 1960s, or I don't think even in the 70s. Of course, it would take, the TARDIS would always take the Doctor and his companions, now her companions, where it felt they needed to go. And we interviewed, it's on the back of the book, but we interviewed Stephen Moffat very kindly gave us a sort of an interview. And he's very practical about Doctor Who. He said to us, "It's a bus. The TARDIS is a bus that takes the Doctor on an adventure." That's all it is. He didn't get into the he just looked at it from a very, very sort of practical, dramatic device point of view. And he also said something interesting. He said, you know, there's when you take over Doctor Who, as he became showrunner, he said there's no book that tells you what the rules are. There's no rule book that's there. And he also made the general point, because we asked him about Time Traveler's Wife, which he'd also written for as a long series, and which I thought was actually good. I enjoyed that. And I said, but that's a block universe. I said, did you find it interesting to move from a universe where things can be changed to a universe where the rule is time cannot, events cannot be changed? And he said, well, the truth is, when you look at Doctor Who, sometimes the rules allow it to be changed, and sometimes the rules allow it not to be changed, or that there are time fixed events. And he said that, but on Doctor Who, we have to come up with so many stories, so many episodes, that in a way you've got to be flexible with the rules, and you find an explanation as to why there are certain events that are time fixed and are not time fixed, depending on them. And there's a scene with David Tennant sort of saying, well, I'm a Time Lord. That's what we do. We look at those events that can be changed and those events that we can't be changed, and you've simply got to accept that, and that's the burden that we have. But again, at a practical level, they said, really, it's because you couldn't really have stories with only one set of rules. It's fine for Back to the Future and for Terminator. Even Terminator slightly changed their rules, frankly, more recently. But because they never had sort of multiverses. But he said, with a series like Doctor Who, you've got to be flexible. And he said, there's no rule. There's no rule book. You don't get the secret book that you're handed. And he was just very practical, I thought.
Okay. Now, touching on you, outside of this 5 hours that you spend every single day, 364 days a year, focused on what you love, do you have any secret hobbies? Anything else that you enjoy, maybe skydiving, stamp collecting?
I'll if you just excuse me for a second.
Yeah.
On my wall, I'll show it to you first.
Okay.
I intend to do this, but since we're chatting, I would like to show it to you.
Okay.
And maybe I should do more of this, because this I did when I was 18. I'm not a very good artist or anything like that, but I drew that when I was 18.
Ooh.
The eyes aren't particularly brilliant, but I hope you can tell it's Miss Barbara Streisand. Mm-hmm. And the nose is all right, but I think so I think I would probably, and I recently did buy some sketch pencils and stuff, and I thought, in COVID, I'm going to do more drawing. I haven't drawn for years. I'm an average talent, but I would like to do it because I used to love it. But I sadly haven't. I don't really get the time to do it. The only quirky thing the possibly peculiar thing that I like doing, that probably very few other people ever do, is I like looking at recordings of birds' nests where the mother or father comes and feeds the chicks. I just find those absolutely fascinating. I don't know why, but I just like to see the chicks being fed caterpillars or worms, and I'm fascinated as how, because often the bird puts the cricket or whatever half in the mouth of one chick and then takes it out and then puts it in the mouth of another, and then I'm fascinated as I don't know why, I just maybe there's something very odd going on there, but I watch these repeatedly, so that's probably the most peculiar. They'll end up in a story, I think, probably at some stage.
So you are an artist and you like watching nature in videos.
Yes, I think
very particular area.
That's there, and I find life fascinating. We have the naturalist David Attenborough, who I think is well known in America as well for his voiceovers.
Oh, yes.
And David Attenborough, that wonderful enthusiasm when he comes across a remarkable creature. And of course, the whole of nature is remarkable, and that's his famous word, because he cannot look at anything without saying, this truly magnificent example of life on earth. And I think that enthusiasm that he has, I have as well, for just the peculiarities. I say that life is peculiar, and it's also peculiar, and it's what's the other P? I keep forgetting. But I'll remember in a moment. But there's it's gone from my head. Forgive me. But he gets the peculiarity of nature and its difference, and the fact that we're all very, very different. Precariousness of nature. So you get the peculiarity and you get the precariousness of it, and I find that fascinating.
You know, that's wonderful.
I think that in a way that goes back to my mother coming home and the precariousness of life. She was alive, and then she sat down and she was no longer with us, and I've never forgotten that as a life lesson. And maybe that's why I've tried to pack so many things in, because I never know when I'm going to sit down and won't be there the next moment. Sounds rather morbid. I don't mean to be. And I think not all my stories are massive. Swidges is massively positive. It's a great sort of life enhancing story. But not all the stuff I write is like that. So I try to vary it a little bit, but I also try to put as much humor into things as possible.
Okay, very good. I'm so happy that you did the David Attenborough impersonation, because my wife and I, that's one of our favorite things to do to relax in the evenings after work, is watch British nature programs. And
well, there we are.
Anything,
that's why we're getting on so well. We've got this
right. Yeah. Anything with David Attenborough, for some reason, his voice is just really, really soothing. And when you were doing impersonations earlier, I almost asked, can you do David Attenborough? And I thought, nah, maybe
well, I can't do very deep. I could never. Well, I can do Darth Vader to a degree, but only by cheating it. But the James Earl Jones characters is not really what I do. But David Attenborough has a lightness of touch and a soothingness that and I was about to say it's the enthusiasticness that his enthusiastic nature that is so compelling, and you can't help but be drawn to look at this turtle or this shark or this worm or this bird feeding their chicks, and it's alive to something that is alive, and he sees the specialness in everything. I don't think there's anything that he's ever talked about that isn't special, and that's a really nice thing to way of looking at the world. Find the special in everything, because nobody's special in that sense. We've all got our own little bit of special, if that makes sense.
It does. It does. Okay. I have realized I've ran way over that hour.
Oh,
I'm terribly sorry.
No, don't be a bother. I just want to
just a couple of more here, if that's okay.
Yeah.
Going back to your origins, when did you first find your voice? And now I know that you have mentioned that you just recently became an author, a published author. and that you've always been a writer and you've always had stories since from a young age. But tell us about your origins of when you found your voice and decided that I am going to be a voice performer, or when you decided that you were going to become an author, and when you made these decisions that this is the direction I'm going to go. Did you have any mentors around you, such as family or educators, that propped you up and supported you and told you that yes, you are talented at this, you need to do it? Did you have external support,
Oh yeah,
or were
I was
you
very lucky at school. I went to a Jesuit school, and the
Mhm.
headmaster wanted a good rugby team and a good dramatic society. And that was how he got the job. He said, I want a good rugger team and I want a good dramatic society. And he greatly believed in drama. So we had a very good sort of dramatic society, and I was in the plays. And then my old primary school teacher from, when I was sort of 7 or 8, she came to see me in one of the shows, and she said to me, Stephen, you have to go to drama school. And that was the
okay?
first time I'd ever heard of drama school. Eventually I did a drama degree, or an English and drama degree. Similar, but not quite the same. Yeah, and I started performing on in public houses and on clubs, working men's clubs, which are sort of, they're difficult to describe. They don't really exist anymore, but you would get a local mining club when they were mining, and it would have its own club with its own members, and there'd be entertainment on a Friday and Saturday night, and I became part of that world. And then went to university, and again, a different type of performance. But you see, I think it's all connected. I think the voice acting is I was thrilled at university to discover that Aristotle uses the word mimesis, imitation, in his book Poetics, and I thought, well, that's me. That's what I do. I'm mimesis, and I'm an imitator. It means something a bit more complicated than that, but I thought, well, I'm doing what Aristotle was talking about, and the stories. I think I would probably, looking back, have probably liked to do more acting. But because I played Mrs. Thatcher for so long, it was very difficult to get seen for what is known in as we call it, trouser parts. So if you're known for a particular type of role, it's very difficult to change. And I found it very difficult to be seen for acting roles where I have played them, but not as many as I would have liked to have played. And as you get older, casting becomes more difficult, and the casting is much younger. And then this is very personal, but and also a bit boring, perhaps. But I'll tell you exactly what happened. I had a urinary tract infection, which was quite painful, and I don't know if you've ever had one, but basically what happens is that,
Yeah,
that they're very painful, and you've got to drink lots of water to flush out, and cranberry juice and stuff which flushes out the infection. And it turned out to be E. coli, and I had to have antibiotics and so on. So it's quite a serious one. And you don't sleep because you're constantly urinating through the night and so on. So I had a week of this. And it was getting sort of better, but I was still suffering. And then in the middle of the night, I had an idea, and I'd never written a story before, for the simple reason that I didn't think the idea. I knew that you'd have to have an original idea, and I'd never had a really original idea. And yet, in the middle of the night, I had this idea for a story, and it was loosely based on a real event, because when I was 50. It was on my birthday, and I came home. To cut a long story short, there was a slate tile fell from the roof, and just missed me a few seconds, and the slate would have landed on my head and quite likely killed me.
Wow.
And the man who came to fix the roof said, these slates are heavy and they're sharp, Steve. He said, if they land on you, they cut. If they had landed on your head, they would have cut into your skull and possibly killed you. And then I thought, did I meet somebody at the top of the road and just chat to them for 20 seconds and say hello? And they stopped me. And then I thought, just suppose that stopping was intentional. And that person knew that there was an accident that was going to literally, as it were, befall me. And what if these are real creatures, and I call them swidgers, that exist to correct your timeline so slightly by 20, 30 seconds that just stops you having an accident? And then I created a whole backstory, a whole mythological backstory of swidgers. And the idea there is that time and the universe are slightly out of joint. It's a sort of Miltonian idea. It's like Paradise Lost in the sense that the world is wrong, and the religious background, Paradise Lost, that's a way of explaining why the world is out of joint. And then I remembered Hamlet's famous line that the time is out of joint, oh cursed spite that I was born to set it right. And I just thought, well, suppose there are creatures that are born to just slightly correct. And then I sat down and I sort of came up with the swidgers. And that's what William and Granny are. They are swidgers, which they're human beings, but they're also sort of cosmic beings that are just exist to slightly make your timeline better and improve it. And I thought, well, that's an original idea. I don't think anybody else has done that. And because most time stories, they're big, they're big events that need to be changed, because that's what stories are based on. And I thought, well, what if it's just small? The smallest, like the butterfly effect in time travel stories, that a tiny little thing can just very slightly put things right. And I thought, well, that's not going to be quite good enough. And then I made William a bit more special, as a special sort of swidger. And then I read about, the way stories work, and basically the story I came up with is the same as Luke Skywalker. It's the same as Harry Potter, and it's very similar to Frodo Baggins as well. It's some degree of supernatural encounter, and a force that wants to take it, and a protector. And then I thought, well, the protectors are normally old men with grey beards. Ian McKellen as Gandalf, and Obi-Wan Kenobi helping Luke Skywalker in Star Wars. And I thought, no, I want my granny. Why can't she be the mentor and protector? And of course I knew her backwards. She'd be my granny. So it's a whole mixture of the personal and classic narrative, children's narrative, really. And I hope I've done it in a slightly unusual way. So then once I'd had that idea, which I thought was genuinely original, I thought, now I'm willing to spend a year writing the book because I believe in it. And I'm passionate about it, and that's what I did. So I took a year off work in terms of performing, and just wrote the book.
Okay. Now, for people watching and listening, if you're watching on YouTube, take a look down below, and you're going to see links to not only Mr. Nallon's official website, Nallon.com, that is Nallon.com, but you're also going to see a link to swidgers.com, which is SWIDGERS.com. So, and there we go. The time that never was. I love that cover. Who did the cover art on that?
Oh, that's the publishers, and
the publisher did it.
It's a sort of time vortex, and actually there's a railway. There's a sort of a railway motif all the way through the Swidgers book, and that's why the logo is shaped as a British railway sign from the early part of the 19th century. So
okay.
Yeah, and it's not finished yet, but there's still, as I say, another book 2 is written. I've just sent it in this week, and that will hopefully come out next year.
Okay. Do you know approximately when next year? I know that some of the
It will
time
be, well,
it takes a while.
the publishers wanted it this week.
Mhm.
I think they're planning. It's on Amazon at the moment, but
Oh,
they
you
are.
can pre-order it now?
I think so. I mean, you
Okay,
can buy both. But the first one is out now,
right.
and it's in print and so on. The second one I think is due out in the February. It may change depending on the edit.
Okay.
I think that's the only thing I would say about that. And then next year I've got to write the number 3. I know what happens in it, but I haven't written it yet.
Okay. So in the 365 days a year that you work 5 hours a day before your brain goes, blah, which translates into until tomorrow, Steve, then you're going to start working on the third of this series.
Yeah, I'm there's various things I'm doing at the moment. I've got to write some talks for schools. I'm writing. My next door neighbor said, "Will you write a lecture for her school?" So I've agreed to do that, and which is a version of one of the chapters in this book, which is the Destination Time Travel, where I talk about Christmas Carol and Back to the Future, and I analyze how those stories are very similar, but how they use the same story rules, but in different ways. So that essentially the fundamentals of storytelling, but the method of the story is very different, and they're both incredibly original and brilliant time travel story. I mean, for them, my two favorite in terms of the sheer craft, originality, and so on of the stories. I think so different, but I find ways to say how that they're borrowing the same story element traditions. And so I do some lecturing as well. So sometimes I'm writing lectures, and sometimes and there's other stuff I write as well. I've got another project. I don't really like talking about things that are not official yet, but I've got another project of another book which I'm working on at the moment as well, which is short stories. And people tell me that they say, "We love your novels, Steve, but you sort of think your short stories are what you should be doing."
Really?
Yeah,
Okay.
they say nobody writes this sort of stuff anymore, and it's very peculiar, very funny, and macabre. So I won't probably go into many more details than that, and that's sort of what I'm working on at the moment.
Okay.
And
Please tell me about that when you can.
yeah,
I'm
of
really
course I
curious
will. I
about
mean,
that.
it's well, put it like this. I've always enjoyed ghost stories. But I don't really want to talk any more about it than
Okay,
that, because
gotcha. Okay,
it's as soon as you talk too much, it never happens. So
right. Okay, gotcha. All right,
I
we're
like
back.
ghost stories.
Okay, you
And
like
here's
ghost
an
stories.
interesting thing, which occurred to me because I read a lot of ghost stories this year. Are ghosts time travelers?
I
Because
thought of that.
they're part of they're still in the present, but they're from the past, not from the future, obviously. But there's an element of time travel in what I discovered reading a lot of Victorian ghost stories. A lot of Victorian ghost stories are not headless people and corpses that are still, as it were, alive. They're not frightening. They happen to people encounter people from 60 years ago going about their normal business, and they don't the person in the present, as it were, can see them, but they cannot see the person in the present, but they just go about. And do you call that vision a ghost, or do you call it a time warp? And there's a few Dickens stories. There's one where he basically gets in a mail coach and ends up in the 18th century. They're not ghosts. They are just 18th century people doing what 18th century people does. And he goes on this ride, and it's technically, I think he calls it a ghost story, but it's more like time travel to me. So that's we discussed that in the Destination Time Travel, to whether or not ghosts are a version of time travel stories.
Okay. Very good. Okay. There are three other things I want to ask you,
Yeah,
and then
sure.
I'll let you go. I promise. And thank you for hanging in there with me so
No,
long.
no,
This is really fun, and I'm
this
so
is the
happy.
long form interview, isn't it? this is
Well, it ends up turning into that, yes. So, the other three things that, while I have you, I cannot help but ask about is your work as a puppeteer, and then your you were featured on a BBC tribute to the art and craft of the Impressionist, Night of a Thousand Faces. I want to ask that. So we got puppeteers, Night of a Thousand Faces. And then I want to hear your Doctor Who story. So which of those three would you prefer?
Well, let's do the puppet, because I've actually got a puppet here.
Okay.
And I'll show you. So I learned, this is from a spitting image. So we'll have to describe it for your audio listeners, but basically the trick with if you have a puppet like this, it's fine. And I'm moving it around, and I'm sort of trying to keep it alive, because that's what Louise Gold told me. Louise Gold worked on the Muppets. She was Annie Sue Pigg, and I said, what does it take to be a puppeteer? She said to me, well, you've got to take something that isn't alive and make it alive. That's all there is to it. And I thought, right, well, that's great, but how do I do that? And what she taught me was everything comes alive when it sees something. When the puppet notices and looks at something, and then looks at you in the camera. This is what I'm doing. So for your audio listeners, I've got the cat, a white cat, and it's staring at a mouse which I'm hanging, and suddenly the cat looks alive because it's definitely seeing something, and he's slightly shocked by it. And then I look to camera, and it looks even more alive. But that I'm not the world's greatest puppeteer, but I learned that craft working with people who worked on the Muppets, and it is a craft, and it took me many years to get right, and I loved it, and I loved working with puppeteers, and I liked puppeteers because actors are very egotistical people sometimes, not all of them, but many. The puppeteer's ego exists from the top of the shoulder down to their fingertips. That's where their ego is. It's not in themselves. In fact, it's the opposite. It's in creating something that is not themselves through through an inanimate object, or an inanimate bit of fur with a couple of dots on, turning that into something that you believe is alive. So it's not just making it look alive, it's making you believe that it is alive. And that's such a wonderful, and children, of course, love it. And actually, adults, I was brought up on the Muppets, Kermit the Frog, and Miss Piggy, and so on. So the joy of puppets, the puppeteers are interesting people. So there was a puppeteer couple. And many of them are gay, and I chatted to John and Ian, who were, as a partnership, a physical partnership in terms of business partnership, but also a loving partnership as well. And I said to John one day, I said, "How long have you and Ian been together?" He said, "Oh, about 25 years now we've been together." And Ian is still alive, is a great guy, but slightly eccentric, but a great guy. And I said, were there any difficult moments? He said, "Oh yes, of course. We did consider splitting up, but we decided to stay together for the sake of the puppets."
Oh.
And he meant it.
Really?
Yeah, absolutely.
Wow.
They couldn't divorce, they couldn't split, because they had created these puppets together, physically made them together, and done television shows with them. And it would mean that they needed to stay together for the puppets, and that was and he meant it. He didn't mean it as a joke at all. And I thought there's something really quite deep here. And it's Geppetto. It goes back to, you know, the puppeteers. All puppeteers love Pinocchio, and they're all Geppetto, I think. You know, the father of Pinocchio, and it's a hugely complex psychological area, but they're just lovely people, because I say they've got no ego. They're wonderful to work with.
And you said that you worked with Jim Henson?
Well, I auditioned for Jim Henson.
Audition. Okay.
No, that was just a job. And I worked with a guy called Marty Robinson. I worked with Anthony Asbury, and these were puppeteers who'd been in Little Shop of Horrors. Marty invited me to. Marty still works for Henson. One of the great thrills was going to New York, and Marty said, "Oh, well, we're working on Sesame Street. Do you want to come to Sesame Street?" Oh. And I said, "Do I want to come to Sesame? Are you crazy?" Spent the whole day on Sesame Street,
right?
You know, and what a lovely family atmosphere that was. It was, you know, a tiny little studio, and they were making Sesame Street, and I thought, here I am on Sesame Street. This is just wonderful. And as I say, they're just lovely people. And Anthony Asbury, who worked on Spitting Image, he'd done Little Shop, and Kevin worked Muppet Man for many years. He recently worked. I got to know him on Dark Crystal. So I got but you know, I'm part of the Muppet world in the sense that I'm invited. With Dark Crystal, I'm on their list, and so I was always part of but very small. I always an extra in the background or something, not any of the major characters. I wouldn't claim that.